Welcome to Gross Domestic Problem, the podcast that tackles America's biggest and most urgent crisis head on. The economy is on the brink. Americans feel it. But what if the real cause of the squeeze in their bank account, like an iceberg about to sink a ship, was mostly invisible? That iceberg? The national debt. Every episode of this show will be focused on unveiling this slow motion disaster. How do we get here? What happens if we don't get it under control? And what's the least painful way out? And what do we do in the meantime? There is no do-nothing solution, and every solution will require some sacrifice. But refusing that pain for ourselves means handing it on to the future with little to no control over who it hurts. And if you're like us, that's unacceptable. So let's dive in. Back, everyone, to Gross Domestic Problem. I, as always, am your humble host, William Glass, though there's nothing humble about this host. I am excited to be here with my fellow Floridian, joining me from the land of Lawton Chiles and Tim Tebow, and I'm sure that she would agree entirely with that presentation of Florida luminaries. We are so excited to have you here today, Brittany. This show is inspired in part by your testimony before the House Judiciary Committee in December. And I read that testimony recently, was thrilled about it, and thought it was just so insightful. I unfortunately have a job where I read a lot of congressional testimonies, and they don't usually inspire me to call that person up and have a longer conversation with them. But this one did. I'm so glad that you're here, Brittany. Would you mind, just for the sake of the people in this audience who don't know who you are yet, and I say yet, and just letting us know who you are, where you come from, how in the world did you wind up where you are? What bets did you have to lose to find yourself situated before a subcommittee on Constitution and limited government testifying about the national debt? Because for a lot of people I know, that seems like you only get there by compulsion.
Yeah. Hey, my mother is constantly asking me why I gave up Naples, Florida for a worse swamp. And like, you could have been happy on the beach all of the time, and instead you went to DC, which still is a swamp, but not the good kind.
Yes.
So I've lost some sort of bet in my life. I haven't quite figured out what I have done wrong to end up stuck in DC instead of home in the freest state in the Republic.
Yes.
But here we are. So I'll give you a quick little background as you asked for, although truly, like, I don't know what anyone could want to know about me more than that I love food in Florida. But I am the executive vice president of EPIC, the Economic Policy Innovation Center. We're a think tank that primarily focuses on budget and economic policy on the federal level. So I spend most of my days dealing with the fiscal side of that. We work very closely with Congress. Prior to helping start EPIC, I was on the Hill for about 10 years, including at the House Budget Committee.
Perfect. Well, I want to hop into your testimony some. I think that testimony started brilliantly. Usually when somebody starts any address off with a quotation from the Founding Fathers, I immediately reach for my wallet. I just feel like I'm basically having a crowbar stuck under me. But in this case, I actually think if we can't get together around the concern that virtually all of the Founding Fathers had about the problems and possibilities of a national debt, then we really can't say anything else about them. Because I'm always blown away by the fact that with all the things they had to see to, with suddenly emerging into nationhood, they cared so much about public debt. Thomas Jefferson famously retired $26 million off of the national debt in his 2 terms in office, saying that he considered public debt to be among the worst to be feared by a republic. Washington said no consideration is more urgent than the national debt. And even Alexander Hamilton, whom national debtniks love to prop up as their sort of standard bearer, even he said, though the national debt could be a national blessing, when the interest rates on the national debt, when the interest paid on the national debt swallows the whole economy, guess what, guys? I can do basic math. It's bad for you. So, and your testimony began with this reflection on the concern of the founders for the national debt, specifically as it related to their prehistory as an English colony. So I just wonder if you go into that a little bit more, like what what is it when you think about the founding generation of this country and their approach to national debt? Like, why should we care? Why did they care? And are there reasons still valid for us?
Yeah, listen, William, I agree with you. Usually when someone starts with the founding fathers, it's going to go in one of two directions. It's either a good reminder to harken back to where we're supposed to be grounding ourselves in policymaking, or it's someone who hasn't been paying attention much, and that's the only thing they know, right? Like when you're asked your favorite president and you say George Washington, and it's like, okay, is that the only president that you know, or is it because you recognize how incredible he was?
Right.
So I am going to go ahead and say that I'm somewhere in between. I'm certainly not the be-all, end-all of knowledge on our founder's history related to the debt. But what I can tell you is I was intentional with my views going into this hearing and setting up this hearing for the members to hear why we needed to even have this conversation. If I had been testifying at a different committee or a different subcommittee, I would not have started the way I started. I think that's important because what we were discussing was not just the challenges in our federal budget. What we were discussing was a change to the Constitution of the United States. And that must be predicated first on a discussion of whether or not dealing with our deficit and debt problem right now rises to that level. I thought it was important, if we're talking about our founding documents and potentially amending them, that we go back and figure out what is it that the founders themselves were considering while they were writing those documents. What were the challenges that they were facing? And does this really make sense? And my conclusion as I was preparing for the hearing was, yes, it does make sense. We do need to think about this. And it isn't just a question of accounting and basic numbers on paper. It's a question of, are we following the fundamental needs of our founders when they were creating this great republic? Are we thinking about the challenges that they saw and they faced? Because if we're not thinking about those challenges, then this is simply a matter for Congress to deal with annually. It is not a matter for the Constitution. But it turns out, yes, we are absolutely in line with some of the challenges that they were facing. And in fact, at some points, they considered a way to address this within the existing framework. It was controversial then, just like it's controversial now.
Sure.
On the side because it was more important to them to get consensus and break free of tyranny.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because when you think about the fact that that's a controverted question, that whether or not the balance of the U.S. budget is something that rises to the level of needing its own place in the foundational charter of the country, that and for a lot of people that seems very, like as you pointed out, it's controversial to say. Weirdly, 48 states have this in their constitutions, and an increasing number of countries in Europe have it in their constitutions. And it turns out that what we may be discovering in the so-called laboratories of democracy is that these things are very, very hard to keep in control if we don't make it something that on which the existential, the existential procedural stability of the country depends. I think I'm reminded of de Tocqueville saying, "Oh, America, it's going to be awesome until the day that Congress realizes that they can bribe the public with the public's own money." And I think that problem, that structural problem, is if anything, like I think what suggests that this is a thing we need to consider as part of what it means for America to be America. I mean, and the fact that this is something that's being considered by House Judiciary is maybe something of a welcome development. And on that day, how did you send, like you obviously the way congressional testimony works is you have your opening statement and then they pillory you with questions for as long as you can put up with it or as long as the schedule allows. What was the subsequent discussion? Did you find that you were in a room full of members of Congress who broadly agree that this is an advisable thing to take up as a matter for amendment to the Constitution? Or did you find that was a difficult line to get across?
One of the things that is interesting about this is I was not there pushing or advocating for a particular balanced budget amendment. I was there as an expert witness talking about the concept of a balanced budget amendment and the need to consider one in general, and providing context for that as a budget expert, rather than saying, here's the specific one that you should be going for. Here are the parameters of that.
Right.
And so you would suspect, and you would be wrong, that the members on both sides of the aisle would want to engage in a meaningful conversation about that.
Right.
Well, we didn't really get to have that meaningful conversation. I enjoyed being pilloried by my friends primarily on the left, sitting on the left side of the dais. And I think that they asked me some questions that they didn't actually want me to have the opportunity to answer because they weren't going to like my answers. And that's fair. That's their prerogative. They are elected officials. I am not. I do not have an election certificate, thankfully. But what is revealing about that is they didn't actually want me to talk about the context of why we're having this conversation. Every time I tried to speak in response to one of their questions about how we got to this position, they wanted to shut me down. Well, why? Because spending is the problem. We don't have a revenues problem in this country. We have a spending problem, and that's something that they take advantage of. So why would they allow a witness to expose that while we're discussing a constitutional amendment?
Right. The Publix money is in abundant supply, and nobody wants to cut that off. I am curious about that, Brittany. I think I'm going to give you the chance to say what maybe they didn't give you a chance to say, because here's my question. So here's what, in defense of the position I think you would take, somebody could say, well, look, revenue's been roughly at 17, 18% of GDP forever. If it gets much higher than that, at least in the times in American history where it's gotten much higher than that, there are threats of pitchforks and bonfires. If it gets, much lower than that, then we have other opposite problems. But this is largely like 17, 18, 19. I mean, I know that's 2% matters a lot, but that's pretty close to where we've been revenue to GDP for most of, at least most of the 20th century. So that's in defense of what you would say. On the other hand, I can think of a handful of economists, many of whom work in DC, some of whom work in universities all over the country, some of whom shamefully work in universities in our shared homeland, who would say that the problem is when you look at the national debt, you can basically chart large increases in the national debt to massive tax cuts, both in the 1980s with Reagan, in the early 2000s with Bush, and in TCJA in 2017. So given that, why should anybody believe that the problem we have as regards to our deficit and debt is a spending problem?
Well, William, you've given me an opening to talk about something else I love, and that's Publix. If you...
Oh, man.
Whoa.
It's so sad. There's one a mile from me right now. There's two within a mile from me right now.
Oh my gosh, please, for me, go get a pub sub, preferably a chicken tenders one. Well, I'm so jealous.
Next time I come, Publix cookies, Publix subs, I'm bringing you stuff.
Please.
Next time I come to DC.
Carry on.
Yeah. Yes, Publix.
Publix. If you are hungry and you go to Publix and you look at your wallet and you realize, I actually don't have any money. I'm out of money. I'm completely out of money, but I've got my credit card. So you go to Publix and you think to yourself, I need dinner. I need to buy food for my family. Okay, let me do that. Let me just make a quick stop. So you go into the grocery store, you walk down the aisle, you get your essentials, you put your you get to the grocery line and you put your groceries on your credit card. That's not necessarily a fiscally irresponsible choice because you needed to feed your children. Great. Is it an ideal situation? No. But we can all understand that there are times of extremes where choices must be made, and that's the reason that we have publicly held debt. That's the reason we have a debt limit as a country. That's the reason that the founders were okay with holding some level of debt, because there are extenuating circumstances. You're not always going to run a surplus. They understood that. They just came out of the Revolutionary War. Now, what happens when you say, well, I got what I needed and the credit card worked. So maybe on the way home from Publix, I stop and I buy myself a ton of clothes. I'm just going to go on a shopping spree. All right. There's a lovely little spot on my way home. I'm going to buy a bunch of new clothes that I don't need. It's just for fun. And then I am immediately after that going to pop into Target. I'm going to let Target tell me what it needs me to buy. I'm not going there for baby formula. I'm not going there for the essentials. I just want to wander around and throw some stuff in my cart because it's going to give me instant gratification. And then because I've been doing all of this stuff, I don't have time to cook dinner, even though I just bought the responsible supplies for that. So I'm going to stop and get myself a steak on the way home. But hey, the credit card's working. So it's fine, right? And I know that I'm going to get paid. And so, okay, I know that how much I've spent today is, say, $500. Maybe only 40 to 50 of that was necessary, but I will get paid tomorrow. And what I'm going to get paid will cover a small portion of what I just spent. So that makes it okay, right? Well, no, you were irresponsible with your spending, so that doesn't change things. And if you get paid more, you now still have the issue of irresponsible spending habits. So that's the trap that we're in. It's not that you can't spend money. It's not that there aren't things that are important and priorities of the federal government to spend dollars on. And we can have a whole separate discussion on what those should and shouldn't be.
Right.
The problem is that we have gotten into this habit of spending beyond our means. And when you have that habit, and it's easy to go for the instant gratification, and you can justify whatever you're doing by saying, it's the future me's problem. Okay, well, that is why we need to sort of pump the brakes here. And that's why I say we don't have a revenues problem. We have a spending problem because it's about this addiction to overspending. It's not that we don't have enough in our wallets. It's that we don't know how to be responsible.
Is your point then something like, even if you let's imagine a counterfactual world where the Reagan tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, and TCJA had not been passed, leaving aside the possible, probable economic effects of that, and leaving aside the morality and questions about whether taxing is okay anytime anybody wants to tax us. Like, imagine just leaving all that stuff that I know you care about aside. Is your point that
in a lot of me right now, William?
Is your point that in a world where those tax cuts hadn't been imposed or hadn't been passed, that we would have just raised the level of spending to the corresponding deficit level anyway, because you don't see evidence that there's any willingness to discipline spending to begin with? Is that kind of how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's it in a nutshell. And my evidence of this is multifold, but the simplest piece of evidence I have for you is that 80% of our spending right now is on autopilot. Members of Congress aren't even reviewing annually 80% of our spending. So when we talk about shutdowns because we didn't pass an appropriations package or whatever the case may be that particular year, or every year it is now, well, what we're really
every 3 months, it turns out, with continuing resolution baseball.
Exactly. What we're really arguing about is the details of 20% of our spending.
Right.
Well, the reason that is a problem isn't just because that 20% is also packed with nonsense. It's that we're not even talking about the 80%.
Right.
And we're intentionally allowing it to continue going out the door.
Right.
That's my
point. I think those, by some estimates I've seen over the next 30 years, we're projected to spend about somewhere between 80 and 100 $1 trillion. I literally can't get my head around that number over the just adding to those programs and their ongoing trajectories. Obviously, recently there's been a couple significant warnings in the last few weeks about the the insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund. I guess it's 2031 is the current expected dry up date.
Yeah, they moved it up a year.
So these, so did you say that? Did you say 2030?
2032, I believe they moved it up a year.
I see. Okay. So these, anyway, but that's not far from now either. In any case, we're looking at a really, really horrible trajectory of spending, primarily in programs that, as you point out, are not reviewed. And so, and then as your testimony pointed out, because they're not reviewed, they're not scrutinized. I mean, so enormous amounts of waste, fraud, and abuse, whatever the waste, fraud, and abuse, I mean, whatever Doge or some future Doge would have found, the fact is that that Congress has basically like neutered itself in the ability to deal with some of the main drivers of growth in the spending trajectory. And so I think that's right. I think, signing up for a mortgage when you don't have money is an interesting thing, because that makes it is an auto, like, I mean, that's coming out of your budget no matter what. So you're basically committing yourself to credit card debt. So I see the sense in what you're saying. My question is, you mentioned this in your testimony, and I'd love for you to talk more about it now. The fastest growing category of spending on the U.S. budget is not something that the public doesn't vote on because Congress doesn't review it. It's something that the public in principle can't vote on, right, because it's just an ongoing interest burden, which, we started pointing out at the top of this interview, even Alexander Hamilton, who called the national debt potentially a national blessing, said, hey, the thing you've got to worry about, though, by the way, is the time that interest becomes too much of a weight for the government to bear. And even, I mean, like, even if you are the most Keynesian economist, even if you sleep beneath an icon and you pray and genuflect before Keynes twice a day, even Keynes said there is a limit past which the interest burden on debt becomes a bigger drag on the economy than the debt can do by stimulating it, or than the stimulatory effects of the debt itself. What in the world is happening with interest on this debt, Brittany?
It's such a problem, William. I wish I had a better story to tell, but unfortunately, the story we have is still the story of overspending. Only this time it's not even overspending, to your point, of decisions that Congress is making now. We're talking about how we're paying off the debt burden, the credit card bill, the interest, not even the principal on that credit card bill, for the bad decisions of the past. And that is just compounding. We're going to be in a situation where very quickly our interest payments by the end of the window, and this is, again, just the interest payments on our bad decisions, will eat up half of personal income taxes. So think about that for a second.
Cash out those numbers. I mean, I totally get what you're saying, but just cash out those numbers for people because a lot of people who listen to this don't know about the window. Like, what does that mean? So over 10 years, something's going to happen. Explain what's going to happen.
So the way that the federal budget is handled is in this 10-year interval. Mm-hmm. We look at projections that are largely 10 years out. We also do like long-term projections and things like that, but we really write based on the 10-year window. The reason that's important is it's part of something called the Congressional Baseline, which is produced by the Congressional Budget Office. This is the baseline that tells us here is what the budget is going to look like and the economy is going to look like if you do nothing. Right. So this is your status quo. Here are the projections for exactly how good, bad, neutral the situation will be based on what's currently happening. Now, there are some things that are a little funky in the baseline, things that Epic would like to change to just make it a little bit more accurate. I think that's a conversation for another time. But just know that this is sort of the standard, it's why it's called a baseline, of the status quo of what happens, where do we end up over the next 10 years if we do nothing. If we do exactly what we're doing right now. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I've got the numbers right in front of me. For fiscal year 2026, which is the year that we're in right now, we're spending $7.4 trillion. Yeah. Our intake, our revenues, is only $5.6 trillion.
About five-ish. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So that leaves us with a deficit of nearly $2 trillion in 1 year.
Yep.
Over the 10-year window, and this is the number that you were saying you saw 100 trillion somewhere. So in the next decade, we will spend cumulatively, if we do nothing wrong and we don't make it worse, we will spend $94.6 trillion. That's just our outlays. That's just what we're actually putting on our card when we go to the cash register. Then we're taking in about $70 trillion.
Yeah.
Which leaves us with it's a $24.4 trillion deficit. We're at the point where these numbers are so big that they almost don't mean anything.
Yeah.
But if you want to sort of drill it down and figure out like, okay, well, what are the real impacts of this? Let's just talk for a second about context. We've been talking a lot about what the founders were thinking of.
Right.
It's a pretty fair assumption that most Americans would agree there are two huge moments in American history that defined freedom for the entire world. That first moment is the revolution, of course, initially breaking free from tyranny, sending good old King George our list of problems and grievances with him, making sure that the Boston Harbor had some nice little flavoring tossed into it.
Yes.
All of that is true. And we talked about that at the top of the conversation. But the second moment where we really had to do whatever it took to defend freedom was World War II. Our debt as a country was at a former high during World War II. And in 1946, so the immediate aftermath of World War II, when spending was at its peak, we had to deal with one of these sort of existential crises I was referring to before. Our debt-GDP ratio, meaning how much of our debt is put up against our gross domestic product, our economic size and capacity and value.
Yep.
The debt to GDP ratio was 106.1% in 1946.
Yeah.
By 2030, so in just 4 years, we're going to outpace that.
Yeah.
It'll be 107.7% of GDP. So putting that in context, what's our World War II? You know, it's one thing to have 6% of GDP going toward our nonsensical debt levels when it's to fight tyranny and save freedom. It's another thing when we're basically spending to enable more tyranny and bigger government within our own country.
Yeah.
And that's a big problem. For sure.
So we're looking over the next 10 years. You mentioned at about we're going to collect around $70 trillion in income taxes over the next 10 years or so. And half of that you said
revenues. So not just income taxes, but
tariffs, whatever else we do. That we're looking at. So taxes are a slightly, they're the dominant portion of that, but not all of it.
Okay.
And that we're looking at something between 20 and $30 trillion in interest payments over the same amount of time, right? So
what we're actually going to end up seeing on the interest side is pretty staggering, because I told you the numbers for all of our revenues collected in 10 years. But if you look at just the last year of our window here, our net interest outlays, so just what we spent on net interest, will more than double what it is now to $2.1 trillion in the last year. And that is just about half of the revenues we take in from your personal federal income tax. So if you just think about like what your tax dollars are going towards, people are saying like, my paycheck's too small, the government's taking too much of my money. Everything that you personally giving the government to run, half of that is just wasted on interest payments from bad decisions.
That's
praying. That's praying we make no more bad decisions between now and
no war. I mean, I don't want to beat what is by now a thoroughly beaten to death horse here, but that's assuming no new wars that cause dramatic needs for more deficit spending. It's also assuming that interest rates don't rise profoundly, which is not that the thing that's really crazy about it, I think, is that like the government pays interest and it doesn't set its own interest rate. I think this is the thing that people don't understand, because they think that like the Fed sets interest rates, and the Fed sets interest rates as a sort of baseline for overnight loans. But it doesn't but what happens is the bond market, independently of the Fed, looks at that number and says, how much more money than that basic quote unquote risk-free rate do I need to compensate me for tying up money for 10 years as a loan to the U.S. government, which is how the government actually raises its debt. I mean, so when they look at that, that's how they set the rates. It's more than that overnight rate, and it's set independently. It's set by whatever investors decide in an increasingly debt-strapped country is an appropriate premium for the risk of lending the government money, and that is not something the government can control. So that there are things. There are levers that the government can pull to take the pressure off of that. But interest rates they're set independently. And so what that means is the rates can rise. This is what Keynes worried about, that the rates can rise. And if they rise a lot, then that it doesn't take very many points of increased interest rates on a 10-year treasury for that interest calculation in CBO's baseline to be totally scrambled.
And here's the other thing to keep in mind, because what you're saying is right, but there's another layer to this. What happens if we do have World War III? What happens if it's not even World War III, but just another major event? It could be the Chinese Communist Party deciding that they want to take over half the Pacific, including Taiwan, and manage to make inroads in taking over shipping lanes. What happens if there's another pandemic? What happens if there's another natural disaster? What happens if there's another Hurricane Katrina type situation where there are shocks that are going through the entire country? You need to have something called fiscal space to deal with that.
Yes, right.
If you don't have the fiscal space to deal with that crisis, you are in a very dire situation. And what we're dealing with right now is that we're running out of that fiscal space. We're running out of it rapidly. If you run out of it, you just don't have the ability to keep borrowing into infinity and beyond. It doesn't exist. This is all fake money that we're dealing with, essentially. I've looked. There is no magic money tree in the basement of the Capitol. I can promise you that. So we're dealing with things that we don't have. It has a real impact, but we're having to make hard, real decisions and support policy makers having to engage in votes on those hard, real decisions, knowing full well the minute-by-minute progression of our current pathway is putting us closer to a debt spiral, a fiscal crisis coming on as a secondary layer to any sort of shockwave that we encounter in the real world. And then I'll just top it off with one more thing, because we both got too excited after our interest conversation. By the end of the window, our interest payments are going to basically match what we're spending on discretionary.
Yeah.
That's crazy, right? Like, think about that. The money that we're actually voting on every year is about the amount at the end of the 10-year window of just our interest payments. And the interest payments are already a bigger part of our federal budget than everything except for Social Security.
Yes. And Brittany, can I steal you for just 10 more minutes? Because I want to get to the concept of a BBA. I want to hear what you have to say about amendments and what the amendment might look like, what policy might look like. And if I have you for 10 more minutes, then I'm going to take one of those minutes to say just that what is astonishing about what you said here. And I think it's worth cashing out for people who aren't economists and don't spend their time looking at CBO baselines and aren't familiar with the actual numbers of this, that what you've just said is that what Congress votes on every year, that budget that we fight like hell over every single year, that budget is going to be matched by money that no one does or can vote on. And the idea that we would continue to be a free people when our budget, when everything that we fight on how to spend, the thing we send congressional representatives to DC to do, is matched by something that nobody in the country can vote on, we will be less free. And I think that's one of the moral force of your testimony before the subcommittee that made me reach back out to you to have this conversation, is that the national deficit and the national debt is not a national blessing anymore. It's a national threat. It actually threatens the freedom of people in this country. And I think people don't perceive the link nearly clearly enough between what we will lose, between the growing of this debt to conditions that are unimaginable, and what we will lose, and the increasing political street fight that is happening in DC. One of the things that people don't understand is the reason it's happening is because the money is going away. The reason that every single political dispute becomes an existential fight of us versus them that necessitates a tribalism that we have to use to basically threaten each other with violence. The reason that's happening is because there's not money for everything anymore.
That's right.
And that's the thing that we're totally threatened by. And if you want to know why your politics is so screwed up, our politics is so screwed up, it's not just because there's a 24/7 bitchy media. It's because we actually are running out of space, and we know it, we feel it, and it's threatening us. And so everything just gets more intense and more threatening by the moment.
That's right. The national debt is a national security issue, and I'll give you a nice little way to wrap right back into our balanced budget amendment discussion. What's the entire purpose of the federal government? It's twofold: to provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the people. That's it. That's all the federal government is supposed to be doing. Okay, well, when that's the case, we have to think about, okay, if we're going to amend the Constitution, we have to make sure that any amendments still hold true to that primary focus. Right. If what we're doing isn't to provide for the common defense and the general welfare, then we shouldn't be dealing with it. And I'm a conservative, so of course I apply this to everything. That's why I am always saying, cut, shut her down. We don't need more of it, whatever it is. My default is no. But it's not just that. I know that morally it's a problem. It's also that I see the writing on the wall. This is going to be an actual a problem that has significant major implications, including our national security. And so if you think about that for a second, and you think about the fact that this hearing on the budget, on a balanced budget amendment, was in the Constitution Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee, that's when you start realizing this is all about limited government. That's what this really is at the heart of the conversation. And so what's the purpose of the debate? It's not how do we get to balance on paper, because if it was how do we get to balance on paper, I've got a million ideas for you. Let me show you my bookshelf full of ideas. That's not the problem. I could tell you how to cut hundreds of billions of dollars right away. Our whole team at Epic can tell you that.
Yeah.
The problem is that you have to find consensus in order to enact something. That has proven incredibly challenging.
Right.
One of the comments that I made at the budget committee is that 10 years ago, at the last start of the last budget window, I opposed balanced budget amendment.
Right.
I thought that it would negate Article 1 powers, that it would limit congressional authority, and that if we only had the fortitude, we could get there on our own. A little bit of that is because I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. But I still consider myself a willful optimist. I'm still fairly bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, okay? Not
Yeah.
even my 1-year-old could take that away from me. I'm like teasing last night, okay? But the the reason that I have that sentiment, the reason that I describe myself as a willful optimist is because I'm tethered to these founding principles. And unfortunately, I don't believe that the majority of policymakers today are tethered to those founding principles. And so, as we're thinking about the Constitution and limited government,
Right.
it does make sense. Would I have loved to be able to sit in front of you and say, no, we don't need a balanced budget amendment because everyone can get there on their own. We can make these good decisions. We have made
Right.
these good decisions. Sure, I would love that to be the case. Unfortunately, here we are. I just looked at the latest debt numbers right before we jumped on this conversation, and we're at $38.76 trillion in national debt right now. It has gotten a lot worse, not any better. And so if we need to provide some sort of, we the people, not the
Yeah.
government, need
Right.
to provide some sort of check on Congress to make sure that they are upholding their limited government responsibility. Okay, that is now a discussion about the people versus their representatives and holding them accountable. It is no longer a discussion of taking away congressional prerogatives or questions about executive versus legislative powers, which was my
Right.
fear a decade ago.
Right.
The balanced budget amendment might actually empower the executive. I disagree with that now, not because I think I was wrong then, but because I have more data now and more events have happened, including the pandemic. So
Right.
now we're at a point where government has grown so exponentially that the people need to have some sort of additional check on the federal government so that Congress does not just continue spending frivolously. And so that when we're engaging with this question, we're looking at it through a constitutional lens. We
Right.
need to be looking at it through a constitutional lens. What is the right of the people here? What is the prerogative of the people here? And why is the federal government failing that right?
Yeah. I don't have much to add to that. I think that's really well said. I might add only that one of the reasons, at least one of the reasons we have a constitution is that there are, and that constitution has some of the amendments that it has, is that we've decided, for example, that at least as of this moment, children born in the United States don't have representatives, technically speaking, but they have rights, and that the Constitution and amending the Constitution have been one of the most important and profound ways of defending those rights. I'm thinking, of course, of the 13th and 14th Amendments. That's how children who are born in the country get the rights of citizens. I mean, procedurally, that's how they get it. They're given it by God, but they get it through it's mediated through the Constitution. And that one of the problems that we have,
protected.
The other constituency that's involved here is the children who are not yet born, who will inherit the burden of a national debt. And that I think at that point you do have a question of whether today's representatives can ever adequately defend tomorrow. The Constitution is how tomorrow defends itself. And so I think it's well said. I want to just give you one more question here. Talk to me about an amendment. You can wave a magic wand over the process, and they're saying, okay, Brittany, tell us what to do. What are you telling them to do? Talk to me about the amendment and the implementing policy as you see it. How should it happen?
I love the magic wand question. If I was emperor for a day, I wouldn't be very American,
right.
but I'd have a good time.
Right.
What I advised the members when they asked me the same question during the hearing is don't think first about what to do. Think first about what you want to accomplish, and then think about what to avoid. because
Yeah.
you have to be conscientious of the pitfalls here. And the pitfalls are numerous and
Yeah.
they're serious. So, number one, and this is my primary concern for pushing back against mini BBA constructions, is you cannot abdicate Article 1 powers. There have been several iterations of a balanced budget amendment proposed over the years that require a presidential signature on the annual congressional budget, not just the appropriations bills. That basically converts the budget resolution into a budget act. In my perspective, that reduces the congressional prerogative and we no longer have co-equal branches.
Yeah.
Because
That's your fear from 10 years ago.
that's my fear from 10 years ago, and it remains true today. I just think that we are now in a situation where we have to find a way to write an amendment that deals with that appropriately. And my hope is we can get there.
Yeah. What else should we not do?
The second thing you should not do is fail to remember that we have a spending problem, not a revenues problem.
Right.
So there are lots of balanced budget amendments, and some of those say balance the budget however you must. Okay, no, let's not do that. That means tax the people into oblivion. So a balanced budget in itself is not what we want. What we want is to limit government and control spending. Don't forget, every dollar that is spent is growth of the federal government, not just growth of the public debt. Okay? So you don't want to allow a balanced budget amendment that is just focused on a spreadsheet getting to zero. Because what that means is that the federal government can continue to overextend itself by just making the people pay more, right? Like you just keep taxing, keep taxing. That's not good either. We don't want that.
Yeah.
The third thing that you want to do is make sure to avoid the lack of a real enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
You have to give a balanced budget amendment teeth, okay? If you don't have an enforcement mechanism, how are you holding Congress to account? And then not only does it mean that the BBA is not being enforced, but it undermines the validity of the entire Constitution.
Of course. Yeah.
So you have to find a way to place limits on spending, not just in theory, but in practice. And it has to be an automatic response.
Yeah.
So those are
I agree with all that.
to worry about.
I agree with all that. I would respond only to the second point, just with this, that your point about actually the point of a balanced budget being that spending reflects people's priorities is well taken. I would say that now any balanced budget would be an improvement over a situation where the government's long-term financial outlook couldn't possibly be taxed away. I mean, that's I'm thinking of of Jessica Riedl's chart book about the deficit over the next 10 years, that you could set the marginal tax rate on the upper 1 or 2 or 4%, however you want to define it. You could set the marginal tax rate to 100%, and it would only take care of maybe a third of it. We're on a trajectory that is so completely nonsensical and irrational that you would have to tax everybody effectively everything in order to do something about it. And that's your point before about the amount of tax revenues that are going to be covered that are going to be taken up just to pay the interest bill.
Here's the problem, William, with all of this. Riedl's right. I love Riedl's chart book on the tax side. But you and I are approaching this from a place of logic. And as we saw during the hearing, that is not always the place that people are approaching this from behind the dais. And so you have to, yes, you're right. There's not a situation in which you actually can tax your way out of this problem. But we still have to guard against politicians saying, well, we're going to try anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Fair. It certainly hasn't. The fact that you can't spend forever hasn't stopped people from trying that. So, I mean, that's a fair point. I think I would say that.
William, stop applying logic. This is DC.
That's fair. It's a fair point. That's why I hang my hat in the great state of Tennessee. Brittany, thank you so much for joining me today. It was an absolute pleasure having you on. We're gonna have to come back here in a few years and just see how we did.
I'm worried about that.
So, Publix subs coming for you the moment I cross the Potomac again.
I appreciate it. I'm holding you to it.
That's all right. Thanks so much. Have a great time. Man, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, thank you for joining on the show. If you want to, I'm sorry, Brittany, I've actually forgotten the last thing I need to say. If people want to follow your work and stay in touch with what you and Paul and others are doing at Epic, what's the best way for them to stay in touch with you?
You can find us online at epicforamerica.org because that's what we're doing, everything for America.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to subscribe to the show. Want to dig deeper? Follow us at millennialdebt.org for more insights, updates, and ways to be part of the solution. Thanks for listening.